16 barrels of wine a year went through Llywelyn ap Gruffydd Fychan's household. 16 tons, the big shipping casks, each one holding the better part of 1,000 bottles by modern reckoning. A Welsh priest named Adam of Usk wrote that detail down in his chronicle, almost in passing, the way you'd note that a man kept a good stable or a generous table. And it's a strange thing to know about someone, because we know almost nothing else about his daily life. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know how he spoke, what he believed beyond the obvious, how he treated the people who worked his land in the hills of Carmarthenshire. What survives is his name, his politics, and the fact that he drank and entertained on a scale that made an impression on a chronicler who'd watched plenty of lords come and go. The wine is the warm part of the story. It's the part where you can almost see the man, a hall full of firelight and noise and the smell of roasting meat, a host pouring out cup after cup for whoever happened to be under his roof. 16 tons is hospitality on a level that says something about how he saw himself, a great man of his district, open-handed, a lord people came to when they needed shelter or a meal or a word in the right ear. Everything that comes after the wine is not warm at all. Welcome in, settle in, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights a little if that's your thing. And do me a small favor while you're here. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from, because I genuinely love scrolling through and seeing how far these stories travel. Some of you are up at strange hours for this, on the other side of the planet. Headphones in, lights off, and I always appreciate the company. A like helps the channel more than you'd think. And if you stick around to the end, there's a proper send-off waiting. Right. Back to Wales, and to a man who chose loyalty over his own body, and paid for that choice with about as much suffering as the medieval state knew how to inflict on a human being. Llywelyn ap Gruffydd Fychan came from old stock. His family held land at Caio and Siliquum, up in the rough uplands of what had once been the kingdom of Deheubarth in the southwest of Wales. They traced their bloodline back through the lords of those valleys to Selif, an early king of Dyfed, the sort of pedigree that mattered enormously in a Welsh world where descent was not a vanity but a kind of legal and social currency. In Wales, who your great-great-grandfather had been, could decide what land you held, what claims you could press, what marriages were open to you, where you sat at a feast, and who had to give way to you on the road. A man with Llywelyn's ancestry was not minor. His father, Gruffydd Fychan, had held the constableship of Caio, drawing a salary of £8 a year for it back in 1359, so the family was clearly trusted with local authority and paid by the powers that be to keep order in their corner of the country. So this was a household woven into the fabric of the countryside, neither royalty nor peasantry, but the solid landed gentry who actually ran rural Wales on a day-to-day level. The men who collected the rents, settled the disputes, raised the local levies when a lord called for fighting men, and decided, when the time came, which way a whole district would lean. The kind of men a rebellion absolutely needed on its side, and the kind a nervous king very much wanted to keep quiet and obedient. His wife, according to the Welsh genealogist Llywelyn, was a woman named Cyaned, a daughter of the Scudamore family of Kent Church. That marriage tie turns out to matter more than a footnote, because the Scudamores of Kent Church were also the family that Owain Glyndwr's own daughter Alice married into. So Llywelyn was not some random hillside landowner who got swept up in events bigger than himself. He was connected, by blood and by marriage, to the very heart of the revolt that was about to consume Wales. The lines on the family tree run straight toward Owain. He had sons, several of them, and tradition holds that 2 of them were riding with Glyndwr's forces when everything came apart. Hold on to that closeness as the story moves, the sons in the rebel ranks, the daughter's family bound up with the prince's own, because it makes sense of a decision that otherwise looks almost like a man walking willingly and clear-eyed into a fire. He had everything to lose by betraying Owain. His own children's lives for a start. His name, his lands, the standing his family had built over generations. When you understand how much was tied up in that loyalty, the choice he made stops looking like recklessness and starts looking like exactly what Adam of Usk said it was. The revolt itself began in September of 1400, when Owain Glyndwr was proclaimed Prince of Wales by a small band of his followers at his estate, and the whole of the Welsh political world cracked down the middle. Owain was a man of some standing himself, educated, well-connected, a landowner with grievances against an English neighbour that had curdled, through the failure of the English courts to give him justice, into something far larger than a property dispute. A quarrel over a stretch of land became, over a few short years, a war for the soul of a nation. Through 1401, the fighting spread north and into the centre of the country, gathering momentum the way these risings do once the first blood is shed and the first castles change hands, and ordinary people start to believe the impossible might actually be possible. In the spring of that year, Glyndwr's cousins, the brothers Rhys and Guillaume ap Tudor, pulled off a daring raid and seized Conwy Castle on Good Friday, slipping inside while most of the garrison was at worship and taking one of the great fortresses of North Wales almost without a fight. In June, Owain won his first real pitched victory at a place called Mynyd Hydgen, up on the bare slopes of Pumlummon. The numbers we have for that fight come from a single later source and should be held loosely, but they describe a wildly lopsided clash. A tiny Welsh force, possibly as few as 120 men, somehow shattered a much larger body of English settlers and Flemish mercenaries, numbering well over 1,000, maybe 1,500. 200 of the enemy reportedly died on that mountainside. The rest broke and ran for their lives. Whether the figures are exact hardly matters. Word of that kind of upset travels fast through a country primed and aching to rise, and it travels in a way that frightens kings down to their boots. Henry IV was that frightened king, though he'd have sooner died than admit to the fear. He was a man who had taken the English throne by force only 2 years earlier, deposing and almost certainly murdering his cousin Richard II, and he could not afford to look weak in any corner of his realm, least of all one that was now openly defying him and beating his armies in the open field. A usurper has to look strong, always, relentlessly. The whole brittle logic of his kingship depended on it, because a man who took a crown by force invites everyone else to wonder whether they might do the same. His answer to Hydgen and to the spreading rebellion was a punitive march through central Wales in the autumn of 1401, the royal army pushing out from Shrewsbury and Hereford and grinding its way through the countryside, meaning to burn the rebellion out of the land itself. Adam of Usk, who lived through all of this and whose sympathies were Welsh even as he made his career in the wider church and the law, wrote that the English ravaged mid-Wales with fire and famine and the sword, sparing neither children nor churches. They billeted themselves in the great Cistercian Abbey of Strata, Florida, one of the most important and revered religious houses in all of Wales, fouled it, partly wrecked it, stabled their war horses in the holy buildings among the tombs of Welsh princes, and reportedly executed monks they suspected of leaning toward Owain. This was not a campaign with any rules to speak of. It was a campaign designed from the start to terrorize, to make the population so frightened of the cost of supporting the revolt that they would abandon it out of sheer self-preservation. And cruelty on that scale does work sometimes. It just also has a way of making martyrs, and martyrs tend to outlast the men who made them by a very long time. Glyndwr's people did the only sensible thing available to them against a larger, better supplied royal army. They refused to stand and fight on the king's terms. They melted into the mountains and the wooded valleys, struck at supply lines and stragglers and isolated detachments, and let the brutal country do half of their work for them. The Welsh uplands in autumn are no place for a heavy army on the march, all bog and low cloud and hidden ravines, the rain coming sideways off the high ground, the tracks turning to sucking mud underfoot, the local people invisible until the exact moment they wanted to be seen. Henry's column went deeper and deeper into terrain it didn't know and couldn't control, chasing a prince who seemed to evaporate every time they got close to him, leaving them grasping at fog. The frustration in that army must have been a physical thing by the time they reached the town of Llandovery, soaked through and short of food and made to look ridiculous by an enemy who wouldn't even give them a battle to lose. Hungry, cold, far from home, beaten not by swords, but by weather and distance, and an opponent who refused to be found. And it was into exactly this mood, this cold, wet, humiliated, dangerous mood, that Llywelyn ap Gruffydd Fychan walked and offered to help. Local tradition, and it has to be flagged as tradition because the contemporary record around this specific episode is thin, holds that when Henry's army reached Llandovery, Llywelyn presented himself as a guide. He told the king he could lead them to Glyndwr. He knew the hills, knew the hidden paths and the high passes, knew the folds of his own country where a hunted man might be sheltering. And the army believed him, because why on earth wouldn't they believe a wealthy, well-born local lord who came forward of his own accord offering exactly the help they so desperately needed? A man of his standing, with his lands and his lineage, had every appearance of someone with too much to lose to risk lying to a king. So they followed him, deeper into the uplands of Deheubarth, day after day, the column trudging through valleys and over ridges and along tracks that led, in the end, precisely nowhere. He walked them in circles. He led the king's exhausted army on a long, deliberate, draining wild goose chase through some of the hardest country in all of Wales, burning up the short and precious autumn days one by one, while Owain Glyndwr quietly and steadily put miles between himself and the men hunting him. With 2 sons in the rebel host and his daughter's family knotted to Owains by marriage, Llywelyn had every reason in the world to send those soldiers the wrong way, and from the way it all played out, not the slightest intention of doing anything else. He had decided, somewhere in himself, that he would spend his own life to buy his prince time. He simply hadn't shared that decision with the English yet. Think for a moment about what that long march actually cost the men in it, because it sharpens what Llywelyn was doing to them. An army on campaign in hostile Welsh country in October was a fragile, hungry thing. The supply train could only carry so much, and once the local population had driven off its cattle and hidden its grain, as the Welsh did everywhere Henry went, the soldiers were living on what they'd brought and what they could seize, and there was less to seize every day. Horses went lame on the stony tracks. Men sickened in the wet. The chronicles of this whole campaign are full of references to terrible weather, storms so fierce that some in Henry's own circle muttered that Glyndwr had conjured them by magic, that the Welshman commanded the very sky. The king's tent was reportedly blown down on him in one of those storms, so the army Llywelyn was leading in circles was not some invincible war machine. It was a cold, soaked, increasingly desperate column of men who needed this chase to end quickly and successfully, and every extra day he spun out made their situation worse and their tempers shorter. He was not just wasting time, he was grinding down the very men who would, when they understood, turn their full fury on his body. He had to have known that. A man who has decided to die for a cause tends to understand exactly who will be holding the knife, and the country he led them through was his own. These were his hills, his tenants, his neighbours and kin, watching from the high ground as the English army stumbled past below, chasing a guide who was steering them away from everything they wanted. There's a particular kind of nerve in that, in standing at the head of a king's army that has the power to gut you on a word, day after day, smiling and pointing toward the next empty valley, knowing the whole time how it has to end. Welsh tradition held on to his name for exactly that reason. He became, in the memory of his own people, the man who fooled a king of England to his face and paid the full price for it without flinching. Eventually, Henry understood what had been done to him. You can almost feel the temperature drop in that camp when the realization finally landed, the king having spent precious, irreplaceable days of his campaign being walked in circles by a man he had thought he'd already won over with a bit of trust and the promise of safety. Every hour Llywelyn had stolen was an hour Owain had used to get clean away into the mountains. No question of mercy remained after that. The betrayal was too pointed, too personal, too humiliating, and Henry had a whole kingdom watching to see whether he was strong enough to hold Wales, or whether he'd be made a fool of by hillmen. Under the Treason Act of 1351, the law that defined betrayal of the crown and laid out its punishment in cold detail, Llywelyn was condemned as a traitor, and the punishment for high treason in that era was not a clean death. It was not meant to be, not in any sense. It was a sequence, an engineered ordeal, designed to take a man apart by stages while keeping him alive and conscious for as long as the executioner's grim skill could possibly manage it. The whole point was the spectacle of suffering. The message hammered home to everyone watching that this, precisely this, is what the crown does to those who cross it. The body of the traitor became a kind of public document, written in pain, read by every onlooker, and meant to be remembered and described and feared long after the man himself was gone. A word about why the medieval state went to such elaborate lengths, because it bears directly on what Llywelyn endured outside that gate. The full penalty for treason had been carefully refined over the previous century or so into a sequence that punished the traitor's body in stages that each carried their own meaning. The drawing on the hurdle marked him as no longer worthy to walk on the earth like other men. The hanging was the common death of a thief and a felon, deliberately shameful for a man of rank. The cutting down while alive and the disemboweling were aimed at the seat of the offence, the bowels where medieval thinking located treachery and corruption, the parts of him that had supposedly conceived the betrayal. The burning of the entrails sent them, and the treason with them, into the fire. The beheading removed the head that had planned the crime, and the quartering scattered what was left so that the traitor could have no whole grave, no single resting place, no shrine for sympathizers to gather at. Every step said something. To a crowd raised on this grammar of punishment, the execution of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd Fychan read like a sentence spoken in a language everyone understood. And the sentence was that this man had betrayed his rightful king and would be unmade for it piece by piece in front of witnesses who would carry the lesson home. On the 9th of October 1401, the feast of St. Denis, they carried out that sentence in front of the gate of Llandovery Castle. Adam of Usk records that it happened in the presence of the king himself and his eldest son, and by the king's express command. That eldest son was the boy who would one day be Henry V, the future victor of Agincourt. The King Shakespeare would turn into a national legend, and in October of 1401 he was about 15 years old, standing in the cold outside a Welsh castle to watch a man be slowly and methodically destroyed. Whatever that did to a 15-year-old, the record doesn't say. Maybe it hardened something in him. He went on to order his own share of hard and bloody things in his reign, executions and sieges, and the slow starvation of a French town, so perhaps a part of that began here, watching what a king's justice looked like up close. Or maybe it was simply one more horror folded into a childhood that already had more than its share. The full traitor's death followed the established form, and the established form was deliberate and cruel in every single step of it. Llywelyn was drawn first, which in the language of these executions meant dragged to the place of death behind a horse, hauled across the rough and stony ground either on a wooden hurdle or simply by the heels. A beating and a humiliation before the real business had even begun. The crowd lining the route to watch a great lord pulled through the mud like a carcass. Then he was hanged. But he was not hanged to death. The hanging in this particular ritual was never meant to kill, and that was the entire dreadful point of it. The executioner let him swing from the rope, let him strangle and kick and gasp. Let the gathered crowd watch the body fight desperately for air, the face darkening, and then cut him down while he was still alive and still aware. still able to feel and to understand exactly what was being done to him and what was still to come. That preserved awareness was the cruel genius at the center of the whole thing. A quick death would have spared him the rest, and sparing him was the last thing anyone intended. What came next is the part the medieval state most wanted remembered, and it's the part that's genuinely hard to say aloud. The body was opened, the belly cut, and the entrails drawn out of a living, breathing man, the genitals cut away, all of it performed while he could feel every motion and every pull of the blade and the executioner's hands inside him. The standard form of the punishment called for the entrails to be burned in a fire built right in front of the condemned, so that a man could watch parts of his own body go into the flames while his heart was somehow still beating in his chest. Only after all of that came the beheading, which by that point would have arrived as something close to mercy, the single clean cut that finally ended the awareness the rest of the ritual had so carefully and deliberately preserved. And then, last of all, the quartering, the headless trunk hacked into 4 pieces with axe and cleaver until there was no longer a man there at all, just parts to be salted and carried off. Now, a careful word about a detail you'll find attached to this story in a great many retellings, because it matters to tell it straight. The popular version says that the English cut out his stomach and cooked it in front of him before the hanging even began, and that his salted quartered pieces were then sent off to be displayed in towns across Wales as a warning to others. Pull those strands apart honestly. The salting and the distribution of the quarters fits the standard practice of the period exactly. Heads and quarters of traitors were routinely preserved with salt against rot and sent off to be spiked up over town gates and bridges across the country, the body broadcast like a proclamation, and there is nothing whatever implausible about Llywelyn's remains being scattered that way, even though the contemporary record doesn't name the specific towns that received them. The stomach cooked before his living eyes, though, is a touch that lives in tradition and in modern dramatized accounts, rather than in Adam of Usk's actual surviving text. It may well have happened. The entrails were certainly burned in front of these victims as a matter of grim routine, so the leap from burning to cooking isn't an enormous one. But it's a vivid, grisly specific of the sort that accretes onto a story like this over 6 centuries of retelling, each generation adding a turn of the knife. And I'd rather set it down honestly as probable embellishment than dress it up and sell it to you as confirmed fact. What we can stand behind from the source is appalling enough on its own. A man drawn through the streets, half-hanged, cut open and gutted while still alive, his entrails burned before him, then beheaded and chopped into 4 pieces, on a saint's feast day, outside a castle gate, in full view of a king and a 15-year-old prince, for the crime of walking some tired soldiers in circles so that his lord could slip away into the hills. Adam of Usk added a single line about him that has kept the man's name alive for 6 centuries now. He wrote that Llywelyn willingly preferred death to treachery. That's the entire eulogy, and it's enough because it tells you the choice was real and that the chronicler understood it as such. He could have actually guided them to Owain. The paths were there, the prince was somewhere out in that country, and a man who knew the hills as well as Llywelyn did could have delivered him. He could have bought his own life and his lands and his sons' futures with his prince's capture. He chose instead the long route through the hills that led nowhere, knowing with perfect clarity where that road ended for him personally. Owain Glyndwr, the prince he died protecting, was never captured and never betrayed. Not in all the long years the revolt flickered and flared and finally guttered out. He simply vanished from the record sometime after 1412, his fate unknown to this day, never handed over for any reward, never seen swinging from any gibbet, never dragged before any king. In a world this brutal, to simply disappear, unbroken and unbought, counts as a quiet kind of triumph. Glyndwr got away. The man torn apart at Llandovery is part of the reason he did, and Adam of Usk at least made sure somebody wrote that down. One last thread before we leave him, because it's the sort of turn that history likes to spring on you when you least expect it. One of Llywelyn's own sons, a man named Rhys, later turned up fighting as a man-at-arms in the army of Henry V, the very prince who as a boy of 15 had stood and watched his father be torn apart outside Llandovery Castle on the Agincourt campaign of 1415. The boy who witnessed the execution and the son of the man executed ended up serving on the same field in France a little over a dozen years later, fighting under the same banner. The wheel turns in ways nobody plans and nobody could have foreseen, the son of a Welsh martyr drawing English wages from the household of the prince who watched his father die. And in the year 2001, near the ruins of Llandovery Castle where the whole terrible thing had happened, they raised a memorial to Llywelyn, a stainless steel figure some 16 feet tall, made deliberately as an empty cloak and helmet, with no body at all inside the armor. The hollow shape was the entire point of it. It stands for a brave man whose actual face has been completely lost to time, and for the precise manner of his death, the body that was opened and gutted and scattered until there was nothing whole left of him to bury or to remember by sight. It rests on a great stone hauled down from Caio, his own country, his own land, finally brought back to the man some 600 years too late to do him any good. From the cold Welsh hills we travel south and east now, across the sea and down into the mountains of northern Italy, where a very different kind of condemned man met an end that makes even Llywelyn's long, drawn-out death look almost merciful by comparison. His name was Dolcino, and the Catholic Church spent years, 4 separate crusades, and the lives of a great many people trying to scrape him and his followers off the face of the earth entirely. They got him in the end, after a fashion, and what they did to him once they finally had him in their hands goes about as far as human cruelty has ever been recorded going. Fra Dolcino came out of the country around Novara in Piedmont in the late 13th century. The sources squabble over his origins, the way they always do with men who become important without being born to importance. Some contemporaries called him the son of a priest named Julius from the Ossola Valley, a child of the clergy, which carried its own faint stain in a church that demanded celibacy and rarely got it. More recent scholarship has floated the idea that he actually came from a family of some wealth, with Ghibelline political ties, which would mean he gave up a comfortable and secure life to chase a burning vision rather than rising up out of poverty into rebellion. A chronicler named Benvenuto da Imola, writing within a century of his death, left a portrait that's worth keeping firmly in mind, because it bears almost no resemblance at all to the monster the church needed him to be. Benvenuto said Dolcino was born at Romagnano Sesia, that he was schooled at Vercelli, that he was intelligent and articulate and persuasive, short in stature, always smiling, and gentle in his temperament. A small, cheerful, clever, mild-mannered man. Sit with that description for just a second, and then set it beside what the full weight of a papal crusade and an executioner's heated pincers eventually did to him, because the enormous gap between the two is a real part of what makes this story land the way it does. They did not destroy a beast. They destroyed a smiling little man who could read scripture and hold a crowd, and they took a very long time over it. He inherited the leadership of a movement called the Apostolic Brethren, sometimes the Apostolici, in the year 1300, after the previous leader, a man named Gerardo Segarelli, was burned at the stake at Parma. So Dolcino stepped into a role that already had a fire attached to it as the standard going rate for holding it. He knew, taking up the work, roughly how the church preferred these careers to end. The movement preached radical apostolic poverty, the absolute conviction that the true Church of Christ should own nothing whatsoever, that property should be held in common among the faithful as the apostles had done, and that the enormous accumulated wealth and worldly political power of the established clergy were a flat and shameless betrayal of everything Jesus had actually asked of his followers. To a population that watched fat bishops and gilded abbeys grow ever richer while the poor around them starved in bad years, this was electric, dangerous, irresistible. Layered over the poverty preaching was a fierce, apocalyptic vision, drawn in part from the writings of the mystic abbot Joachim of Fiore, that history itself was about to turn over into a third and final age, the age of the Holy Spirit, in which the corrupt institutional church would be swept entirely away, and a purified community of the Spirit would inherit the world. Dolcino taught that this age was imminent, that the great cleansing was coming very soon, and possibly that he and his own followers were meant to be its vanguard, the first wave of the new world. To a poor, taxed, tithed, lorded over population grinding through hard times, the promise that the whole rotten, oppressive order was about to be overturned by God's own hand landed like a thunderclap on dry ground. By one account in the New Catholic Encyclopedia, Dolcino's eloquence and his agreeable manner and his real skill with scripture drew him something close to 4,000 followers. Treat that number gently, since medieval sources inflate crowds the way fishermen inflate the size of the one that got away, but the movement was unmistakably large enough and committed enough to genuinely terrify the men who ran the church and the lords who ran the land. Beside Dolcino, through all of it, stood a woman, Margarita of Trent. In a letter he wrote in December of 1303, Dolcino named her as his beloved above all others, his cherished companion in the work and the faith. The inquisitor Bernard Guy, who was very much not a friendly or a fair witness, called her his concubine and his lover, La Bella, the beautiful one, and made a whole string of lurid accusations about the nature of their relationship, including the inflammatory claim that Dolcino taught the Holy Spirit itself had made her pregnant. Coming from an inquisitor whose entire professional purpose was to paint heretics as depraved and blasphemous and sexually corrupt, those specific charges deserve to be held well at arm's length, weighed for what they were meant to do. What comes through from the less hostile angles is that Margaret was a woman of beauty and of some wealth, possibly from a comfortable background like Dolcino's own may have been, who threw her entire life into this man and this movement without reservation, and who would, at the very end, be offered every chance to walk away and save herself, and would refuse each and every one of them. She is a harder figure to see clearly than Dolcino because the sources spend so much less ink on her, treating her as an appendage to him. But everything about the manner of her death says she was every bit as immovable as he was, and possibly more so, because she had even more on offer to tempt her into recanting and turned all of it down. The church did not negotiate with people who taught that it should be stripped of its wealth and swept off the earth. Pope Clement V authorized an outright crusade against the Dulcinians, the same legal and spiritual war machine that was usually pointed at Muslims in the distant Holy Land, now turned and aimed at a community of poor Christian radicals up in the Italian Alps. It took 4 separate crusading campaigns, led by the Bishop of Vercelli, with armed contingents tied to the powerful Visconti family of Milan and assorted local lords who had their own reasons to want the sect gone, to grind the movement down. That figure is worth pausing on properly. Not one expedition. 4. A small religious community of believers in apostolic poverty held off the organized military power of the church and its noble allies for years on end, retreating ever higher into the Valsesia, into the brutal high country where the Crusaders' advantages mattered less, fortifying mountain positions, and finally digging in for the last stand on a peak called Monte Rubello, sometimes recorded as Monte Zabello, above the town of Biella. The hostile chroniclers blamed the cornered sect for raids and arson and killings down in the surrounding valleys, and some of that is probably true enough, because several thousand people driven up into the mountains with crusaders steadily closing the ring around them will raid the lowlands for food when the stark alternative is watching their children starve, and starving is exactly what they were doing. The accounts of cannibalism that appear in those same hostile sources, the claim that through the killing winter the trapped Dulcinians ate the flesh of their own dead to survive, come from witnesses with every motive in the world to make these people sound like animals deserving of extermination, so they hang under a heavy and permanent question mark. The starvation itself, though, was real, and it was lethal, and it did far more to defeat Dolcino in the end than any crusader's sword ever managed. It's worth slowing down on what those years on the mountain actually involved, because the endurance of Dolcino's people is half of what makes the ending so hard. The sect had not simply wandered up into the hills to hide. They had moved first to one peak, the Parete Calva, the bald wall, and held it, and when that position became untenable through the winter cold and the pressure of the Crusaders, Dolcino led the survivors in a brutal midwinter march across the mountains to the Monte Rubello. People died on that crossing in the snow, moving at night through high passes to escape an encircling army. The ones who made it dug in on the new peak and built fortifications, ramparts and ditches and wooden defences, and from there they raided down into the Valsesia for the food that kept them alive one more week at a time. For something close to a year, they held that position against everything the Bishop of Vercelli could throw at them, beating back assaults, enduring bombardment, watching their numbers thin from cold and hunger and the steady attrition of the fighting. These were not soldiers. They were weavers and farmers and labourers, and their families who had followed a preacher into the mountains because he promised them a cleaner world, and they fought off a crusade for a year. Whatever you make of their beliefs, the sheer physical stubbornness of it is staggering, and it meant that by the time the end came, the people on that mountain had already been pushed past the limits of what bodies are supposed to survive, which is part of why the final assault went so quickly. Almost nothing remained of them to break. The winter of 1306 into 1307 broke them completely, blockaded on the mountain, burned out of their lower positions, cut off from any supply. The community endured cold and hunger that killed them by slow and steady degrees through the dark months. They ate herbs pulled from under the snow with frozen fingers, whatever animals they could trap or catch, whatever the iron-hard frozen slopes would yield up to them, and it was nowhere remotely near enough to keep several thousand people alive through a full alpine winter at that altitude with no resupply. Here is a detail that genuinely unsettles me every time I come back to it. The poet Dante Alighieri actually wrote Dolcino into the Inferno during these very months, while the man was still alive and still freezing on his mountain. In the 28th canto, among the sowers of discord and schism whose punishment is to be endlessly cut and split apart, the shade of the Prophet Muhammad, learning that Dante is a living man who will return to the world above, sends a message back through him. He tells Dante to warn Fra Dolcino, if the friar ever hopes to follow Muhammad down to that circle soon, to arm himself well with supplies, so that the press and weight of the snow will not hand an easy victory to the men of Navarra. Dante was composing that passage at almost exactly the moment the real Dolcino was freezing and starving on Monte Rubello, with the snow piling up around his fortifications and the men of Novara and Vercelli waiting patiently below for hunger to do their work. And the snow was, in literal and historical fact, about to hand his enemies absolutely everything. A poet, hundreds of miles away, wrote a doomed and useless warning into a poem about a man who was, at that very moment, running out of the days the warning was meant to buy. It's one of the strangest collisions between literature and lived reality in the whole of the medieval record, and Dolcino himself almost certainly never knew he'd been written into the greatest poem of the age as he died. On the 23rd of March, 1307, the Crusaders finally stormed the mountain. After years of stubborn resistance and a whole winter of slow death thinning the defenders, the assault itself was over quickly. The people on the peak were too weak, too starved, too few left standing to hold the walls. Dolcino was taken alive, along with Margaret and a close companion named Longino of Bergamo, and the three of them were brought down out of the mountains to Biella, And there the church's careful machinery turned to the deliberate question of how precisely to end them. The Inquisition examined them at length. The secular authorities then pronounced the actual formal sentence, because the Church much preferred to keep its own hands ritually and theologically clean, and let the state carry out the bloody work of killing on its behalf, a useful fiction everyone involved understood perfectly well. A date was fixed. The 1st of June, 1307, near Vercelli, on the banks of a river called the Cervo, and the manner of death they designed specifically for Dolcino and Longino was not burning, or at least not only burning, and it was not quick. It was meant from the first to be the longest, most public, most agonizing death the assembled authorities of that place could possibly engineer for a human being. A punishment whose entire purpose was to make an example so terrible that no one would ever follow Dolcino's road again. What happened on that day is recorded in a contemporary account, the Historia Fratris Dolcini, written by someone close enough to the events to be either a quiet sympathizer or a local eyewitness, and the description is specific in a way that is genuinely hard to take in. Dolcino and Longino were bound hand and foot and placed up on carts, raised high enough that everyone in the great assembled crowd could see them clearly, could see every moment of what was coming. In front of them, on the carts themselves, were set vessels full of burning fire. The fire was not there to burn the men, not at first. It was there to heat the iron. Executioners took pincers, iron pincers heated until they glowed red and then white in the flames, and with those pincers they began to tear the living flesh off the two bound men, piece by piece by piece, gripping a fold of skin and muscle with the searing iron and ripping it bodily away and throwing each torn piece into the fire, and then reaching in and doing it again and again and again. And then the carts were rolled forward. The whole grim procession began to move cart by cart through street after street after street of Vercelli, so that the punishment would be drawn out for as long as humanly possible, and the torment made as public and as prolonged as the entire town could be made to witness. At each new place along the route, the carts halted, and there was more of the heated iron. More flesh gripped and torn loose and burned, the smell of it hanging over the crowd, the wounds cauterizing even as new ones were opened so that the men could not simply bleed to death and escape. The entire design was built around duration, around making it last. The authorities did not want these men to die. Not soon, not yet. Not for a long while. They wanted them kept alive and conscious and aware through as much slow, methodical mutilation as a human body could possibly be forced to survive, paraded the whole agonizing time so that the maximum number of people could stand and watch it happen and carry the memory home. A 19th century writer who told this story in close detail, working carefully from the surviving old sources, described Dolcino seated high on an ox-drawn cart and paraded street to street across the entire town, the white-hot pincers applied to him again and again and again, until, by his account, all the flesh was torn piecemeal from the man's limbs, and only then, when what remained of Dolcino was barely recognizable as a body at all, was he, still somehow apparently alive and aware, finally given over to the flames. the most extreme specifics that circulate widely about his death, the claim that they tore off his nose and then his genitals at particular planned stops along the route, trace to later and considerably shakier retellings, rather than to the earliest contemporary text. So I'll set those down as the embellishments they almost certainly are, even though the reality was terrible enough not to need them. What the earliest source actually gives us is the pincers, the high carts, the slow, deliberate procession through the streets, the flesh torn off and burned away by degrees over the course of a long and public journey through a whole town. Reportedly, through the entire ordeal, Dolcino made no sound at all. He did not cry out, did not beg, did not give them the scream they were working so hard for. Whether that detail is literally true or something admirers attach to a man they were determined to remember as a martyr, no one can say with certainty at this distance of 700 years. But it became part of how those Italian valleys remembered him, the small smiling man from Novara who would not so much as cry out even as they pulled him to pieces with red iron through the streets of Vercelli. Margaret died alongside them, and the sources disagree on exactly how she was killed and in precisely what order. The Historia Fratris Dulcini says she was burned first, before Dolcino's own eyes, the man deliberately made to watch the woman he had called his beloved above all others go into the flames before his own ordeal had even properly finished, one final cruelty stacked on top of all the rest. Bernard Guy's competing version has her torn to pieces in front of him instead. The accounts don't line up cleanly, and we simply can't resolve which is true from this distance. But the shape of it is consistent across both. She was offered her life. She was offered marriage, wealth, position, a clean and comfortable walk away from all of it. If she would only recant, only deny in words what she had spent her entire life believing in her bones. And every single time the offer was made, she said no. She went to her death rather than disown the cause, and she did it knowing in full and exact detail what the alternative on offer actually was, having presumably seen or heard what they intended to do to Dolcino. She tends to get a handful of lines in the histories where Dolcino gets pages and chapters, which is its own small, quiet injustice, because by every account that survives, she was as unbreakable as he was, and she had a great deal more reason and more opportunity to break, and didn't. The movement effectively died there on that riverbank near Vercelli, on the 1st of June. The 4,000, whatever the real figure had ever truly been, scattered or recanted or simply went silent and melted back into ordinary anonymous life, never to be heard from again under that name. But the memory of Dolcino lingered in those Italian valleys for centuries afterward, passed down, the cheerful little man from Novara, who held a mountain through a winter that killed his own people around him one by one, and who was then driven through a town on a cart while they tore him apart with heated iron, and who, if the oldest story is to be believed, would not give them so much as a single cry for all their patient and terrible effort. The valleys around Biella and the Valsesia did not forget him, and that's a real and slightly strange afterlife for a condemned heretic. Centuries later, local memory still attached his name to the mountains where he'd made his stand. The peak itself, and the long ridge carried associations with him, and the story of the sect that starved and fought up there became part of the landscape's own folklore. Much later still, in the modern era, he was claimed and reread by people who saw in his preaching about common property and the corruption of the rich an early ancestor of their own ideas, and monuments and obelisks went up in the hills to mark where the Dulcinians had fought and died. The radical friar reinvented as a kind of mountain martyr for causes he could never have imagined. Whether any of those later readings would have meant a thing to the actual man, the smiling, scripture-quoting preacher who thought the age of the Holy Spirit was about to dawn, is anyone's guess. But it says something that an execution designed specifically to erase a man, to tear him to pieces so completely that nothing whole remained and no grave could hold him, ended up doing the opposite. They turned him into exactly the sort of figure they were trying to prevent. The pincers and the carts and the long procession through Vercelli were meant to be the final word on Fra Dolcino. They became, instead, the reason anyone still says his name at all. We stay in the 14th century for the next one, but we cross back to the west, into France, where the very lowest orders of society were about to do something so shockingly violent that the chroniclers could barely make themselves write it down, and where the one man who tried to give that violence some shape and discipline was undone, in the end, by a piece of ordinary human courtesy that he extended to people who had no intention on earth of returning it to someone like him. Guillaume Cale was a peasant from Mello, near Beauvais, in the country north of Paris. You'll find his name written half a dozen different ways across the sources: Cale, Carl, Caille, Calais, the spelling sliding around the way names always did before anyone thought to fix them in place on paper. The chronicler Froissart hung the mocking nickname Jacques Bonhomme on him, Jack Goodfellow, the generic and faintly contemptuous name the French nobility used for the peasant in general, the simple, plodding country fellow who was supposed to know his place and stay quietly in it and be grateful. And it was from that very sneer, that throwaway aristocratic insult, that the whole uprising got the name it carries to this day, the Jacquerie. We know frustratingly little about Cale as an actual living person. His exact age, his family, his face, the sound of his voice, all of it gone, swallowed by the centuries. What even the openly hostile chroniclers concede about him is that he was a strong and capable man, a Picard with a natural gift for eloquence and some genuine prior experience of war, a man who could stand up in front of a screaming, grieving, half-mad crowd of armed peasants and actually organize them into something resembling a force, instead of merely shouting along with them until everyone involved got slaughtered. That is a genuinely rare ability in any century, in any kind of man. He had it. And for a few short weeks in the summer of 1358, it very nearly changed the whole shape of France. The revolt erupted at the very end of May in 1358. And to feel the true size of the fury behind it, you have to feel everything France had been put through in the years leading up to it. 2 years earlier, at the Battle of Poitiers, the English had not merely beaten the French army in the field, they had captured the French king himself, John II, taken him prisoner and carried him off to England to be ransomed for a sum so staggeringly enormous it threatened to bankrupt the entire kingdom for a generation. With the king gone across the sea and the realm effectively leaderless, the unpaid mercenary companies that had been fighting the long war roamed loose and lawless across the countryside, robbing and burning and raping and killing more or less as they pleased, because there was no longer an enemy left to fight in any organized battle, and no authority anywhere strong enough to rein them in. The Black Death had swept through less than a decade earlier and butchered the population, leaving far fewer hands to work the land under demands that had not shrunk to match. And on top of every other crushing burden, the peasants were still expected to repair and rebuild the stone castles of the very same nobles who had so spectacularly and shamefully failed to protect them at Poitiers, and to help fund the colossal ransom of the king those same nobles had managed to get captured. The accumulated weight of all of it, the defeat and the brigands and the plague and the taxes and the forced labor and the bottomless contempt, finally caught light in the Oise Valley at the tail end of May. And once it caught, it spread like a grass fire across a dry field in the height of summer, faster and further than anyone watching could quite believe was possible. The peasants fell on the manor houses and the castles, more than 150 of them by some counts, and the violence that poured out of them was the particular and frightening kind that years and years of swallowed humiliation produce in ordinary people when the lid is finally and suddenly torn off. The chroniclers Jean Le Bel and Jean Froissart, both of them aristocrats writing for an aristocratic audience, and both of them genuinely and personally horrified by what they were describing, recorded atrocities that you absolutely have to read with their heavy bias held right up in front of your eyes the entire time, because men of that class were temperamentally and completely incapable of being fair about peasants rising in arms against their betters. Le Bel wrote of a knight seized and killed by the peasants, then spitted whole on a roasting pole and turned slowly over a fire, while his wife and his children were forced to watch every moment of it. The woman afterward raped by many of the men in turn, and then made to eat the roasted flesh of her own murdered husband before she and the children were all killed too. Froissart took stories like that one and repeated them and heightened them and lingered over them with what reads, frankly and uncomfortably, like a certain dark fascination. Modern historians treat the very worst of these accounts as exaggerated and weaponized, as deliberate propaganda designed in large part to justify the savage and disproportionate reprisals that were about to follow, and they point out pointedly that the official letters of amnesty, later issued by the Crown itself, are far more measured in tone and actually reserve a good deal of their criticism for how the nobles had behaved. So you have to hold the whole thing carefully and honestly. Something genuinely brutal absolutely did happen in those weeks, a real and bloody and furious settling of generations of accounts. Peasants doing terrible things to the lords they had every accumulated reason in the world to hate. But the precise, lurid catalogue of horrors, the spitted knight and the forced cannibalism and the rest, owes a great deal to the imagination and the agenda of frightened, vengeful noblemen. And it probably tells you nearly as much about their nightmares and their guilty consciences as it does about the actual documented events. Cale, to his very real and genuine credit, was not trying to run a massacre. He was trying to turn a mob into an army, which is a far harder and a far more genuinely dangerous thing to even attempt. He organized a proper council. He appointed captains and lieutenants and imposed a chain of command on men who in their whole lives had never obeyed anyone but a lord and a parish priest. He had his people forge real weapons out of their farm tools. Scythes and billhooks, straightened and reshaped and bound to long poles, until they were something that could actually punch through armor and kill a mounted knight, and he had them improvise crude protective gear of their own out of boiled and hardened leather. He adopted Montjoie as a battle cry, which was the old French royal war shout itself, and he put the fleur-de-lis, the royal flower, on his banners. That last choice was pointed and deliberate and clever. By flying the royal flower and shouting the royal cry, Cale was signaling clearly that this was a revolt aimed at the nobility specifically, at the lords who had failed and oppressed them, and not at all against the captured king himself, a careful distinction that mattered enormously to Cale, even though it was completely and contemptuously lost on the nobles he was actually fighting against. He reached out toward Paris, where a powerful and ambitious merchant named Etienne Marcel was leading a parallel rising of the city's townspeople, and Cale tried to stitch the rural revolt and the urban one together into a single coordinated movement that the crown and the assembled nobility could not simply crush one isolated piece at a time. For a few genuinely astonishing weeks in the summer of 1358, it really did look as though the very bottom of French society might reach all the way up and rearrange the top of it. Sit with how unlikely Cale's whole position was for a moment, because it makes what the nobles did to him land all the harder. Here was a man with no rank, no land, no formal training in command beyond whatever rough soldiering he had picked up somewhere, and within the space of a couple of weeks, he had several thousand armed men actually answering to a structure he had built up out of nothing at all. He had sent word to the towns. The men of Paris under Etienne Marcel sent help, supplies, even some trained crossbowmen, because Marcel saw in the rural rising a useful source of pressure on the same nobility he was busy fighting in the capital. Cale's people pulled down or blockaded fortified houses across a wide stretch of country between the Oise and the Seine. For those few weeks he was, in everything but name and official recognition, a genuine commander running a genuine campaign. The nobility's terror in this period was not entirely manufactured for the chronicles afterward. They really did believe, for a short stretch of that summer, that the natural order of things might come apart in their hands, that the men who ploughed their fields and repaired their walls might actually rise up and pull them down for good. That fear is exactly why the reprisal, when it finally came, was so wildly out of proportion to anything the peasants had actually managed to do. You do not kill 20,000 people to punish a few burned manor houses. You kill 20,000 people because for 2 weeks you were genuinely and personally afraid, and the fear has to be answered afterward with something total. The man who personally ended that possibility was Charles II of Navarre, a French prince with a real and serious claim to the throne and a reputation for treachery so thoroughly and richly deserved that history simply remembers him as Charles the Bad. Around the 10th of June, near Mello, Charles brought up a force of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 mounted knights and professional men-at-arms, hardened soldiers in full harness, and he faced Cale's much larger, but vastly and hopelessly worse-equipped peasant host across the field. And here Cale showed once again that he genuinely had a real head for war on his shoulders. He had positioned his people on good defensive ground, with a line of carts and baggage drawn up to break and blunt a cavalry charge, archers and crossbowmen set out in good order to do damage at range before the enemy could close, and a reserve held back in hand for the decisive moment of the fight. He had done, in short, about as competent and professional a job of preparing a battlefield as an entirely untrained farmer leading other entirely untrained farmers could conceivably have done, and Charles the Bad, looking across the field at that well-prepared position and at those large numbers, decided that he did not actually want to throw his precious and irreplaceable armoured knights straight into the teeth of it, even with every advantage of training and equipment and breeding stacked on his own side. A frontal assault on a well-set defensive line manned by desperate men was a reliable way to lose a great many expensive horses and a great many expensive noblemen. So Charles chose not to fight. Instead, he sent word inviting Cale to come and talk, to parley, the ordinary and ancient courtesy that commanders extended to one another before, or in place of, a pitched battle. And right here is the exact point where Cale's entire understanding of the world and his own new place in it betrayed him utterly and fatally. He had come, over those heady weeks, to genuinely believe that he was a legitimate commander now, a captain general at the head of a real army, and that the established customs of war, including the ancient and near-sacred safe conduct of a parley between leaders, applied to him exactly as they would apply to any other commander of armed men anywhere. So he walked into Charles's camp under that fatal assumption. He brought no hostage with him to guarantee his own safe return, took no bodyguard, and trusted entirely in the conventions of chivalry that were supposed to govern how men of war treated one another, even in the middle of a conflict. And the nobles in that camp seized him the very instant he was within their reach, because in their eyes, in the eyes of every armoured man there, those conventions simply did not extend to him and never had for a moment. A low-born man, a peasant, was not a belligerent owed the courtesies of honourable war. He was an animal who had grotesquely and offensively overreached his God-given station, a beast of burden pretending to be a captain of men, and the entire code of chivalry that protected a parley simply did not cover such a creature, any more than it covered a horse or a dog. The good faith that Cale extended that day, the simple human assumption that his honour would be met and answered with honour, ran headlong into a solid wall of men who had decided in advance, before he ever arrived, that a peasant possessed no honour at all for them to bother respecting. He was a fool to ever trust them, the chroniclers more or less conclude with satisfaction. But the foolishness, when you look at it clearly, was really nothing more than his belief that he was a person, a man among men, and that single belief turned out to be the one thing his enemies absolutely refused to grant him. With their leader taken by that treachery, the peasant army at Mello came apart almost at once and was ridden down and slaughtered where it stood. Charles's mounted knights cut through the now leaderless and demoralized mass of farmers, and the killing fanned out across the whole surrounding region in the days that immediately followed. Thousands died in the battle itself and in the merciless hunting that came after it, including, by one account, some 300 peasants burned alive inside a monastery where they had fled and taken shelter, the building deliberately set alight around them while they were trapped within. A terror swept the entire country around Beauvais, the nobility taking a revenge so wildly disproportionate to the original offence that, by the grim and careful arithmetic some historians have since worked out, perhaps 20,000 peasants died in the reprisals all told, set against the few hundred named noble victims that the chronicles dwell on so lovingly and at such length. The lords carefully wrote down the name and lineage of every single knight the peasants had killed. The peasants who died by the thousand in return are mostly just a round number, a footnote, an estimate. And Cale himself, he was tortured, and then he was beheaded. The single most famous and most repeated detail attached to his death is the mock coronation. The story goes that before they finally killed him, his noble captors crowned him as King of the Jacques, King of the Peasants, with a circlet or a tripod of red-hot glowing iron pressed down hard onto his living head, in savage and deliberate parody of the kingship they had accused him of secretly reaching for. That particular detail comes down to us through later writers rather than the very earliest sources, including the historian Barbara Tuchman, who was careful and honest enough to frame it as something reportedly done to him rather than as fully confirmed fact, and the very same grotesque trope of the burning iron crown shows up around other executed peasant leaders elsewhere in Europe. Most famously of all, it attaches to György Dózsa in Hungary a century and a half later, who was quite genuinely seated on a throne of red-hot iron and crowned with a glowing iron crown, and made to suffer a list of horrors beyond even that. So the red-hot crown for Cale sits in that uncertain and frustrating middle ground, a vivid and entirely possible and entirely period-appropriate horror that the earliest sources don't quite manage to pin down for certain. It may well have happened to him precisely as the story tells it. It may also have drifted onto his story over time from the wider grammar of how the powerful like to humiliate and unmake the rebels who had frightened them, the burning crown being just about the perfect mocking punishment for a man accused of trying to crown himself king. The treachery that took him under a false parley and the beheading that finally finished him are solid historical ground. The crown of glowing iron is the part to hold a little more loosely in the hand, but solid or not, confirmed or merely reported, the heart of the whole thing remains exactly the same. Guillaume Cale, who tried against all odds to give a leaderless, grieving, furious peasant rage some discipline and some shape and some genuine honor, died in the end because he extended a basic human trust that his enemies had already privately and contemptuously decided he was simply too low-born ever to deserve. Across the Channel, in the very same brutal and disordered era, another great popular rising was building steadily toward its own bloody ending. And at the very heart of it stood a man who fought not with scythes and billhooks, but with words alone. A wandering preacher whose single most famous line had already been rattling around inside English heads for years before the country finally and spectacularly exploded. John Ball had been preaching for roughly 2 full decades before the great peasants' revolt of 1381 gave him his moment in the sun and, very soon afterward, his death. He described himself as a sometime priest of St. Mary's in York, and he later settled down in Colchester, but his real pulpit, the place he actually did his work, was wherever ordinary common people could be gathered together to listen to him. He was excommunicated again and again, going back to the mid-1360s, formally and repeatedly banned from preaching by the church authorities, and thrown into prison more than once, because the things he stood up and said terrified the men who ran England right down to their deepest foundations. He stood in churchyards and in crowded marketplaces and on village greens, out in the open air where the church could not so easily silence or stop him. And he told plain, ordinary, downtrodden people that they were not, by God's original design, the property of their lords. His most famous formulation has come down through the centuries almost completely untouched, still sharp. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Turn it over slowly in your mind for a moment. He is saying that back at the very beginning of everything, in the Garden of Eden itself, when the first man dug the earth with his hands and the first woman spun the thread, there were no lords and no serfs at all, no gentlemen and no bondsmen, no one born to own other people and no one born to be owned. That entire vast division of humanity into masters and slaves was not made or ordained by God. It was made later by men, by what John Ball flatly called the unjust oppression of wicked men. And the obvious, dangerous electric conclusion that follows directly and inescapably from that is that what men had made, other men could unmake. Hostile chroniclers tried very hard to tie him firmly to John Wycliffe and the Lollard heresy, to bundle 2 separate threats to the established order neatly into a single convenient package they could condemn together. But Ball had been preaching his egalitarian fire for years before Wycliffe ever rose to real prominence, so that particular connection is mostly a deliberate smear rather than any real intellectual debt. Consider what 20 years of that preaching actually meant in practice, because it tells you why the authorities feared one wandering priest out of all proportion to his apparent power. Ball had no parish, no settled living, no institutional protection of any kind. He moved from town to town, talking to people out in the open, and the church kept catching him and silencing him and locking him up, and he kept getting out and doing it all over again. By 1381, he had been at it long enough that his ideas were no longer his alone. They had been heard, repeated, chewed over in alehouses and at market stalls across the whole southeast of England for the better part of a generation, when the Archbishop of Canterbury formally condemned him years before the revolt ever began. The very condemnation spread his name further still. He was exactly the sort of figure the medieval church found almost impossible to deal with, because every fresh attempt to shut him up only seemed to prove his point about the power and the reach of the men sitting at the top. Chroniclers later claimed he had run a kind of coded correspondence network in the run-up to the Rising, sending out strange short letters under invented names like John Shep and Jack Truman, full of rhyming proverbs urging the common people to stand together and beware of deceit. Whether those letters were genuinely his work or were pinned on him afterward to make the Rising look better organized and more sinister than it was, they capture the one thing the authorities could not stand about John Ball. He spoke to ordinary people in plain language that ordinary people actually remembered and passed along, and you cannot hang a rhyme, and you cannot quarter an idea that is already loose and running in 10,000 heads. When the revolt finally broke out in June of 1381, sparked directly by a hated and clumsily, brutally collected poll tax landing on top of years and years of grinding accumulated resentment, rebels from Kent broke open the Archbishop's prison at Maidstone, where Ball happened to be held at the time, and set him free into the Rising. He went straight to Blackheath, just outside London, where the great rebel host had gathered in its tens of thousands, and he preached to them all on that same beloved text, and by the account of the Anonymala Chronicle, he urged them onward and upward, to kill the lords and the great fat churchmen, to cut out the rot at the very top of society root and branch, and have done with it. For a few genuinely extraordinary days, the rebels held London itself in their hands. They dragged the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, who was also the King's own Chancellor and one of the single most powerful men in the entire realm, bodily out of the Tower of London. And they hacked his head clean off on Tower Hill, an act that would have been almost literally unthinkable to anyone just a single month earlier. It reportedly took several clumsy blows of the blade to finally finish the Archbishop off. A botched and messy and prolonged killing of a senior churchman by a furious, untrained crowd, his head taken off in pieces rather than a stroke. And John Ball stood there among the very leadership of it all, alongside Wat Tyler and Jack Straw, in that brief, astonishing window of days when the entire ancient old order of England genuinely trembled on its foundations and looked, for a moment, as though it might actually fall. And then it collapsed, the way these great risings nearly always did in the end. Wat Tyler was killed at Smithfield, struck down treacherously during a parley right in front of the 14-year-old King Richard II himself, and the leaderless rebel host, suddenly frightened and without its captain, lost its nerve and its direction and its momentum all at once, and began to melt away back toward the villages it had come from. And the crown, recovering its balance and its courage with remarkable speed, set about methodically and coldly, hunting down every single man who had helped to lead the rising against it. Ball fled, but they ran him down at last at Coventry and brought him under guard to St. Albans, where the King's Chief Justice, Sir Robert Tressilian, was holding the trials that would punish the revolt and put the proper fear of the crown back into the bones of the country. Ball was given something fairly unusual for a condemned heretic and traitor, an actual chance to speak at his own trial, and he used that chance not to plead or to beg for his life, but to calmly and openly confirm absolutely everything they accused him of. He admitted every charge freely and without flinching or evasion. He stood squarely by every word he had ever preached over 20 years. He did not repent, and he did not for a moment pretend to repent. Thomas Walsingham, the St. Albans chronicler who recorded all of this in such close detail, wrote that on Saturday, the 13th of July, after hearing the full account of Ball's scandalous and openly confessed crimes, Tressilian sentenced him to the full traitor's death, the drawing and the hanging and the beheading and the disemboweling and, in Walsingham's own careful phrasing, to use the common everyday words for it, the quartering. The Bishop of London, William Courtenay, then stepped in and secured a delay of 2 days, specifically and explicitly so that the priest might have a little time at the end to repent his sins and save his immortal soul before the end came for his mortal body. John Ball took those 2 granted days and used them to do precisely and pointedly nothing of the kind. He went to his death exactly as he had lived his life, unrepentant, certain, and entirely unbroken to the last. On the 15th of July, 1381, St. Swithin's Day, at St. Albans, in the direct presence of King Richard II himself, the sentence was carried out upon him. The boy king, still only 14 years old, watched the man whose preaching had helped to set his entire kingdom alight be drawn through the streets of the town behind a horse, then hanged from the gallows, then taken down again still living and beheaded. Then his body opened up and cut apart into 4 quarters. Walsingham records the whole thing plainly enough, without flinching. Ball was drawn and hanged and beheaded before the king, and his body was then divided into 4 quarters and sent off to 4 separate cities of the kingdom. His severed head was carried down to London and set up high on a pike on London Bridge, the traditional and very deliberately public spot reserved for the heads of traitors, where it would have looked blindly out over the river alongside the blackening, rotting heads of whoever else had crossed the Crown that bloody summer season. The 4 quarters of his body were dispatched to 4 different towns to be put on open public display, the standard barbaric advertisement of exactly what the Crown did to any man who dared to challenge the natural and God-given order of things. As it happens, and there's a strange bleak fitness to it, the records don't actually preserve which 4 towns received the quartered pieces of John Ball. So the priest who spent his entire life passionately insisting that all men were born equal under God was scattered, in the very end, across 4 anonymous places that history itself didn't even trouble to write down by name. There's a small detail from the immediate aftermath at St. Albans that tells you a great deal about the cold mood of the authorities once they had finally and firmly regained the upper hand. Other local leaders of the rising, men like William Grindcob, who had led the rebels in the town of St. Albans itself, were hanged at around the same time as Ball. And when their grieving families came forward afterward and tried to take the bodies down from the gallows to give them a quiet and decent and Christian burial, King Richard personally ordered the corpses hung straight back up again to keep swinging in the open air as a continuing warning to everyone who passed beneath them, The dead were not to be permitted any privacy or any peace at all. Even the simple raw grief of the families, even the most basic and ancient human wish to bury your own dead in the ground, was deliberately overruled in the interest of making the public example as complete and as lasting and as visible as it could possibly be made. The bodies no longer belonged to the people who had loved them. They belonged now to the Crown's message. And yet John Ball's plain sermon outlived his quartered, scattered, nameless town body by a very long way indeed. That single line about Adam delving and Eve spinning kept right on echoing down through English history for centuries, quoted and re-quoted and carved onto banners by reformers and rebels, and ordinary frustrated people pushing back against the powerful, long after the priest who first made it famous had been hacked into 4 pieces and sent off to 4 forgotten towns. They could scatter the man easily enough. The one sentence proved a great deal harder to kill than the body that spoke it. We end this one back in France, in Paris, in the blood-soaked year of 1418, with a man whose entire profession was the killing of other people on the state's behalf, the official, sanctioned, salaried killing, and who discovered, the way that such men occasionally and instructively do, that the blade is ultimately loyal to no one at all, and does not particularly care whose neck it happens to find itself pointed at when its master changes his mind. Capeluche was the chief executioner of Paris, the master of the high works, as the grim old official title went, the man who personally carried out the city's death sentences from around the year 1411 onward. He served under King Charles VI, the king history remembers as Charles the Mad, whose long and recurring bouts of genuine insanity left France effectively leaderless at the very worst possible moment in its history. The throne occupied by a man who sometimes during his episodes believed that he was made entirely of fragile glass and might shatter into pieces if anyone so much as touched or jostled him. With the king lost inside his own broken mind for long stretches at a time, 2 great rival noble factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, tore the whole country apart between them in a bitter civil war that was laid directly on top of the ongoing grinding war against England. Capeluche was the city's headsman, the professional who did the actual cutting and the hanging for wages, but in the swirling chaos of those particular years, he became something far more dangerous than a mere functionary of the courts. He became a leader of the Paris mob, tied closely to the powerful butchers' faction, the men of the slaughterhouses and the markets who actually controlled the streets of the capital whenever royal authority dissolved into nothing, as it so often did. And the executioner started making the law himself, out in the open street, with the roaring crowd at his back and his axe in his hand. A man whose entire social position and identity had always depended completely on doing exactly and only what the state told him to do, suddenly deciding all on his own who would live and who would die. The year 1418 was when the city of Paris drowned in its own blood. At the very end of May, through the treason of a man who unlocked a gate in the dark and let Burgundian troops slip quietly into the sleeping city, the Burgundian faction seized control of Paris and took the mad king himself into their keeping. And then, the killing began in deadly earnest. In the middle of June, a mob fell upon the Armagnac prisoners being held in the city's various jails and butchered them right where they were caged and helpless. Among the dead were some of the very greatest men in all of France, including the Count of Armagnac himself, who was at that time the Constable of France, the single highest military officer in the entire kingdom, and the Chancellor of France, the keeper of the King's seal, along with bishops and learned scholars dragged from the university. The estimates of the total dead in that June massacre run anywhere from around 1,000 all the way up to as many as 5,000 souls, with a figure somewhere around 2,500 being the one that historians tend most cautiously to settle on. The chroniclers describe indiscriminate, frenzied butchery, people pulled bodily from their cells and cut down in the streets and in the prison courtyards with no trial whatsoever, no sentence pronounced, no mercy of any kind shown to anyone. One single image from those June killings, recorded by the chronicler Juvenal des Ursins, has refused absolutely to leave readers' minds in the 6 centuries since. A pregnant woman was stripped naked and murdered in the open street, and her killers stood and mocked the desperate movements of the dying child still inside her opened body, jeering at it as it stirred and struggled. Capeluche rose to power inside exactly that atmosphere, that very air. A city in which the entire ancient machinery of law and justice had been completely replaced by the raw and bottomless appetite of the crowd, and in which a professional killer with a strong arm and a famously steady hand could climb right to the very top of the growing heap of corpses. To grasp how startling Capeluche's rise really was, you have to know what an executioner actually was in that society, because the whole shock of his story rests on it. The headsman occupied a strange and contradictory place in the medieval world. He was a public official, paid by the city, essential to the daily working of its justice. And at the very same time he was a profound outcast, a man that other people would not eat with, would not touch, would not let their daughters go anywhere near. His house was often deliberately set apart from the rest. In some towns he was made to live outside the walls entirely, or out by the gallows, or down among the slaughterhouses in the blood and the offal where he belonged in the public mind. He was granted certain unusual rights as a kind of compensation for all the contempt. The right to take a portion of goods from the market stalls, to claim livestock that strayed, to keep the clothes of the very men he put to death. People crossed the street to avoid passing close to him. The taint of the work was believed to cling to him physically, to make his bare touch a defilement. And this was the man who, in the swirling chaos of 1418, found the old rules suddenly suspended and the roaring crowd at his back, and discovered that the same hands everyone had always shrunk from could be used to take a whole city by the throat. For a few weeks, the single most despised man in Paris was also one of the most powerful. And from everything the chroniclers say, he enjoyed every moment of it, which is precisely the sort of thing that gets a man both remembered and killed. His own great hour, if you can stomach calling it anything of the sort, finally came in August. At around 4 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of August, 1418, some 3,000 or 4,000 Parisians of the lowest and roughest trades rose up in arms yet again, And this time they rose with the executioner Capeluche riding mounted at their very head, up on horseback, leading them through the dark pre-dawn streets like a captain personally leading his troops into a battle. They stormed the great fortress prison of the Châtelet, dragged out all the prisoners held inside its walls, around 200 souls in total, and killed every one of them. Then they turned their attention and their weapons on the wealthy townsfolk, the haute bourgeoisie, the respectable rich of the city, looting their fine houses and adding still more fresh bodies to the day's mounting count. When the Duke of Burgundy himself, John the Fearless, the single most powerful man in all of France at that exact moment in time, came in person to the Bastille to confront the mob face to face and order them to disperse and go home, something happened that scandalized every last chronicler who set it down on paper afterward. Capeluche, a common executioner, a man whose very touch was widely considered to be polluting and defiling, whose lowly, bloody trade marked him out as one of the very lowest and most despised creatures in the whole rigid social order, walked up and addressed the great Duke as his own brother. He called him beau-frère, brother-in-law, kin and equal. And then he reached out and took the Duke's own hand and shook it man to man, sealing a bargain struck between the two of them over which of the captured prisoners would be spared and which would die. A headsman clasped the bare hand of a prince of the royal blood and called him family to his face, and he did it, as Juvenal des Ursins wrote afterward with evident open disgust, as boldly and as easily as if he himself were a great lord born to it. And then, having struck that bargain hand to hand, Capeluche promptly broke it, going right ahead and beheading the prisoners anyway, sparing only a single one of them, and that one only because the crowd around him specifically and loudly demanded that particular life be spared. The sheer staggering inversion of the proper order of the entire world, a defiling common executioner treating a sovereign Duke of France as his equal and his kinsman in the open street, seems to have unsettled and frightened the chroniclers very nearly as much as all the cooling bodies stacking up in the gutters did. John the Fearless decided coldly that the mob had to be broken, and being a clever and an utterly ruthless man, he chose to break it with a well-aimed lie rather than with a pitched battle in his own capital that he might very well lose. He put out the word through the city that an Armagnac army was secretly massing at Montlhéry, just outside the walls, a deadly and immediate threat that needed meeting at once with force, and he called upon the armed rabble to march out of the city and crush it before it could strike. Around the very end of August, some 7,000 of them streamed out through the gates of Paris, weapons in hand, to go and confront an enemy army that did not exist and never had existed anywhere except in the Duke's calculating mind. And with the mob conveniently gone from the streets, drawn off into the empty, quiet countryside chasing a phantom, the Duke moved against them fast. Capeluche was quietly arrested in a tavern in the Halles quarter, the great central market district he knew so well, tried with a remarkable speed that tells you plainly the verdict had already been decided well in advance behind closed doors and sentenced to death. Crossbowmen and armed loyal citizens took up careful positions at the crossroads of Les Halles to make absolutely certain that no remaining remnant of the crowd could rush in at the last moment and rescue their captain. and the chief executioner of Paris was led out to be executed in the very heart of the same district where he had so very recently held bloody court over so much killing of other men. The man who had cut off so very many heads in his career was about to find out, in the most direct and personal way it is possible to find out anything, exactly what the whole business felt like from the other side of the block. And this is the precise point where the story turns into something almost impossible to sit quietly with, and I want to be completely and absolutely clear with you that this part is not some later legend dressed up and embroidered for dramatic effect. It comes straight and direct out of a contemporary source, the journal kept faithfully by an anonymous Parisian all the way through these terrible years, the work we know today as the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, written by someone who was actually living right there in the city as all of this unfolded around him in the streets. The man brought in to behead Capeluche was brand new to the trade entirely. He was Capeluche's own designated successor, an inexperienced novice, very possibly his former valet or his assistant, who had quite simply never done this particular work before in his life, and had no real idea at all how to go about doing it properly and cleanly. And Capeluche, standing there at the block in the last minutes of his life, his own hands untied at his own specific request, did the one thing that defined his entire strange and bloody existence. He instructed the man. He calmly and patiently explained to the nervous, fumbling new executioner exactly how the job was to be done right. The proper professional manner of cutting off a head in a single clean stroke. He arranged the wooden block himself with his own hands, positioning it just so for his own neck and his own face, getting the angle and the height exactly right by long habit. And then, the journal records. He took an unhurried moment to trim some wood away from the handle of the axe and from the edge of the knife, adjusting and preparing the very tools of his own imminent death, making absolutely sure that every instrument was exactly as it should be for the work ahead. The journal states plainly that he did the whole of this precisely as if he meant to perform the office on someone else entirely, as if it were just another ordinary working day, and there were some other condemned man's neck waiting on that block instead of his own, at which sight everyone gathered around to watch was left utterly and completely astonished. And only when he had finished setting the entire stage of his own death properly and professionally, like the consummate craftsman he had always been at his terrible trade, did he finally cry out aloud to God for mercy upon his soul, and bend his own neck willingly down onto the wood, and let the trembling green novice he had just personally trained take his head off. A 19th century historian named Sismondi later retold that whole scene in words that still get quoted to this very day, and for a long time afterward readers naturally assumed that he must have been embellishing it, gilding the lily for effect, because surely no man could really coach his own killer step by step through the work of killing him. But Sismondi was not inventing or embroidering anything at all. He was simply and faithfully paraphrasing the contemporary journal that lay in front of him. The anonymous bourgeois of Paris really did write it all down in his own time, very nearly as it happened, the executioner calmly instructing his own replacement at the block. Now, It does rest entirely on that single witness, and it's only fair and honest to note that clearly. The other major chroniclers of the same period, Pintoin and Monstrelet and Juvenal des Ursins and the rest of them, all describe Capeluche's fall from power and his execution without including this particular self-instruction scene at all, so it is one source rather than a confirming chorus of many. But it is a genuinely contemporary source, written by a Parisian who was demonstrably present in the city throughout the whole Terror, and who recorded so very much else of it with real accuracy. And there is no good reason at all to doubt the essential heart of what he set down. A professional killer, faced at the very last with a rank amateur about to bungle the most important cut of all, could not, even standing at his own execution with death a breath away, quite stop himself from teaching the man how to do the thing properly. A couple of the more dramatic flourishes that have attached themselves to his death over the intervening centuries stand on noticeably shakier ground than that block-side lesson does. You will read in a number of places that they first cut off his hand, the very hand that had dared to reach out and clasp a prince of the blood, and call him brother as an equal, as a piece of pointed and fitting symbolic punishment for the offence, and that his headless body was afterward hung up by the armpits at the great Montfaucon gibbet on the edge of the city, where the corpses of executed criminals were strung up in rows to rot slowly in the wind as a long warning to all. The hand-cutting detail reads a good deal more like a meaningful, poetic, satisfying flourish of the sort that gets added to a story by later tellers than like something firmly and plainly recorded in the earliest contemporary text. And while Montfaucon was absolutely the usual and expected final destination for a body like his, that specific gruesome ending seems to be attached to Capeluche mainly in the later and the more popular and dramatic retellings, rather than in the oldest and most reliable account. What that earliest source actually gives us, and gives it to us with that astonishing, almost unbearable, matter-of-fact specificity that no later writer could have invented, is the chief executioner of Paris, in the final minutes of his own life, patiently and professionally, teaching a frightened green beginner the correct way to cut off a living human head, arranging the block and trimming the blade with a craftsman's lifelong care and habit, and then calmly laying his own neck down on the very wood he had just adjusted, so that the lesson he had only that moment finished giving could be put immediately and personally to its intended use. That'll do it for this one. 5 people, 5 very different roads to the wrong end of a blade or a heated iron, and not one single clean or merciful death among the whole lot of them. If you manage to make it all the way through that with me, you have got a far stronger stomach than most, and I'm honestly grateful you chose to spend the time here in the dark. The single most genuinely useful thing you can do for the channel, if you've got a spare second before you go, is to tap that like and hit subscribe, because that really is the thing that quietly shoves the next video out in front of fresh eyes. I also keep a Patreon ticking along, where everything lands early and stays completely free of ads, if you ever feel like wandering a little deeper into all this. But mostly, I'm just glad you came along and sat with these 5 for a while. None of them got much of a kind send-off in their own century, so a few thousand strangers paying close attention to them now, 600 years on, feels like a small and fair and decent thing to do. Tell me down in the comments which one of them is going to be following you to bed tonight. I'll see you in the next one.